Good evening and welcome back to Haunted Tales. Tonight we venture deep into Alaska's frozen wilderness, a land of silence, shadows, and ghost towns swallowed by ice and time. Scattered across America's last frontier are 10 abandoned settlements, each one carrying secrets darker than the endless winter nights. Towns where entire communities vanished without warning, leaving behind empty cabins, collapsed mines, and whispers carried on the cold wind. From Portlock, where terrified residents fled overnight, to Kennecott, where miners still swear they hear voices echoing in the shafts. These are not ordinary places lost to history. These are places marked by sudden disappearances, strange deaths, and encounters with something that cannot be explained. Once, fortune seekers came chasing gold and copper. Instead, many found only tragedy, and a haunting that still lingers in the permafrost. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to Haunted Tales for nightly journeys into the darker side of history. And now let's step together into the abandoned graveyards of Alaska, where the wilderness remembers, and the dead do not rest. The southern coast of Alaska is a place of vast, unforgiving beauty. Sheer cliffs tower over restless seas, their faces streaked black with rain and time. The spruce forests press in thick and dark, swallowing light even in midday. Fog rolls in heavy, curling over the coves like a living thing. To be there at night is to know true isolation. No highway hum, no distant lights, only the weight of silence. It is here, along one lonely bay, that the ghost town of Portlock lies. A place abandoned not from famine or economy, but from fear. Families left with only what they could carry. They abandoned homes, tools, boats, even schools. They fled as if pursued, and in a way they were. For generations, the Alutiiq people warned of a being they called Nantinak, a spirit that walked between human and beast, massive, violent, and cunning. To speak its name was to invite its attention. To see its tracks was to know you were being watched. And to hear its cry was to know death was close. The people of Portlock came to believe they were living in its hunting grounds. The story begins in 1905 with a man named Elijah. He was a hunter, well known for ranging far into the forest. Elk, moose, bear, he tracked them all. He was the kind of man who laughed at superstition, the kind who trusted his rifle more than old stories. When Elijah failed to return one week, the village grew uneasy. A search party of 3 men went after him. They followed his usual path into the forest, finding the remains of his fire pit and fresh tracks. But what lay beyond chilled them. Elijah was there, sprawled on the bank of a shallow stream. His ribs had been forced outward, as though something enormous had crushed him. His face was beaten so violently it was unrecognizable. His rifle, always strapped to him, was gone. Only the snapped leather sling remained. One of the men who found him, an elder named Joseph, later described the scene in a quivering voice. It wasn't a bear. A bear tears claws leaves its mark. This was different. His chest was broken like a child would snap a stick. And there was no meat taken, no scavenging, just death. They wrapped Elijah's body in canvas and carried him back. The village mourned. But in the quiet afterward, Joseph whispered the word that others were too afraid to speak aloud: Nantiinak. 2 decades later, Portlock attracted a group of outsiders. American lumberjacks contracted to harvest timber from the steep ridges. Among them was a man named John Meyer, who kept a journal. His entries began as matter of fact, notes about rainfall, equipment, meals. Then, halfway through that summer of 1920, the tone shifted. Something follows us at night. Last evening we heard it, a cry, not human, not beast. Too deep, too ragged. The air stank after, like rot and wet fur. John described how their camp was circled. Trees cracked in the dark, and stones rolled down from unseen hands. In the morning, they found prints in the mud, barefoot, human in shape, yet enormous, nearly 2 feet long. One night, 3 men failed to return from their cutting site. Their saws and axes were found abandoned, scattered in the grass. Their tent was ripped down, canvas shredded. No blood, no bodies. Meyer's last entry reads, "The locals refuse to go back into the forest. They say the spirit is awake again. We leave tomorrow. I do not argue." By the 1940s, Portlock had grown into a bustling fishing outpost. Smoke rose from canneries and families lived close to the shore. Yet even then, the sea gave its own horrors. Two brothers, Daniel and Isaac Thompson, remembered the night their father did not return from setting nets. Search boats went out at dawn. They found his skiff drifting in the cove. The bow had been shattered, splintered inward. The nets were tangled halfway aboard as if something had climbed in after him. Blood smeared the planks. Isaac later told a visiting priest, it wasn't fish blood. It wasn't from the sea. It smelled wrong, sweet foul like sickness, like something not meant to touch this world. The body was never found. The brothers moved away within the year. Portlock had a small schoolhouse run by a young woman named Margaret who had come from Anchorage in the late 1940s. She later told her niece about the night she realized the town was doomed. It was late autumn. She stayed after dark, correcting papers by lamplight. The wind had risen, rattling the windows. Then she heard footsteps, slow, heavy, circling the building. She thought it was one of the older boys playing tricks. But when she stepped outside, lamp in hand, the schoolyard was empty. Only snow and silence, except for the prints. They were huge, bare footprints pressed deep into the frost. They circled the building, then vanished into the trees. I locked the school that night, Margaret said years later. But I knew then it wasn't the children who needed protecting. It was me. Among the final families to leave was that of Mariah, a girl no more than 15 at the time. She remembered the night it happened in fragments. The pounding rain, the wind shrieking through cracks in the wood. Then came the sound. Scratching, deliberate, along the outer wall of their cabin. At first, her father thought it a stray dog. Then came the knock. 3 heavy blows that shook the timbers. He seized his rifle and flung the door open, firing into the dark. Muzzle flash lit the rain, but nothing answered. No blood, no tracks. Only the lingering stench, thick, metallic, and rotten. 2 days later, her family boarded a boat. They left clothing, furniture, even heirlooms behind. "We never said goodbye," Mariah recalled. "We just ran. By 1950, the church bell rang no more." The cannery stood silent. The school closed its doors. Families left in clusters, then alone, until only the wind moved through the empty homes. Portlock was deserted, not by slow decay, but by flight. Even outsiders sensed it. A mail carrier once wrote that delivering to Portlock was like walking into a grave. "No sound, no children, no laughter," he said. "Only the forest breathing." One might think the story ended there. But Portlock's shadow reaches forward even now. In 1973, crab fishermen anchored offshore claimed to see a figure standing on the cliff above. At first it seemed like a man. Then it shifted, and they realized it was nearly twice the height of any man they'd ever seen. Broad, silent, watching. Before they could point their rifles, the fog swallowed it. In the 1980s, a hunter followed moose tracks into the forest near the ruins. Soon, he saw another trail alongside, enormous barefoot prints that matched his step for step. They did not fear, did not cross. They followed him. He turned back, heart hammering. At the shore, the prints ended as though the thing had vanished into thin air. In 2015, campers reported stones striking their tents through the night. At 3 a.m., they saw 2 glowing reflections in the forest, high above the ground, spaced far apart like lanterns. They watched until their courage broke, then fled before dawn. To the outside world, Portlock is just another ghost town, another casualty of economics, isolation, the harshness of Alaska. But to the Alutiiq it is proof. Their elders warned of Nantinak. Their parents repeated the stories. And their children still refuse to camp near that cursed bay. The cabins are still there, sagging under moss. The shoreline still eats away at the abandoned cannery. But no one stays after dark. Fishermen skirt the cove. Pilots fly wide of the cliffs. They say the air is heavier there, the silence sharper, as if something unseen waits in the trees, patient, watching, remembering. What happened at Portlock may never be explained. Some say it was a killer, hiding in the woods, never caught. Others claim it was nothing but stories. But those who found crushed bodies, massive footprints, and the smell of death in the air would argue otherwise. High in the Wrangell Mountains of Alaska lies the ghost settlement of Kennecott. Once it was a boomtown built on copper, a place of fortune, ambition, and exhaustion. Between 1911 and 1938, men worked in shifts 20 hours long, hacking ore from veins that glowed green and red in the lantern light. They lived in company barracks, ate in mess halls, and watched their youth bleed away in the tunnels. The mines produced hundreds of millions in copper, fueling wires, war, and industry across America. But when the ore dwindled, Kennecott was abandoned. Houses emptied overnight, machinery rusted where it stood. The red-painted mill still clings to the mountainside, like a skeleton of ambition. To this day, hikers and explorers who wander through whisper of something deeper than industry that clung to those tunnels. A darkness buried with the ore, something that fed on the endless fatigue, greed, and suffering. This is the story of what the miners themselves began to suspect. Long before the town shut its doors, the mines were a labyrinth. Narrow tunnels bit deep into the mountain, branching into side passages that twisted like veins. Lanterns flickered dimly, and the air was damp with copper dust. The deeper the men went, the more the walls seemed to close in. In the summer of 1917, a miner named William Bill Anders was on the night shift. He was known for his endurance, a man who rarely complained even after 16 hours underground. But that night, he stumbled out of the tunnel at dawn with wild eyes. His co-workers swore he looked like he'd aged 10 years. Bill babbled about hearing voices in the rock. Not echoes of his fellow miners, but whispers, soft, deliberate, threaded through the dark. They spoke his name, he said, and laughed. "I thought I was losing my head," he told the foreman, hands trembling. But then the lanterns went out. Every damn one of them. And I wasn't alone down there. When asked what he meant, Bill refused to explain. He quit the next day, abandoning his tools. He left Kennecott without even collecting his last pay. Later that year, in Tunnel 4, a collapse killed 3 men. Rescue crews dug for days, pulling bodies from the rubble. But one man, Samuel Briggs, was never found. Weeks later, another crew swore they heard knocking deep in the stone, faint but steady. They believed it was Samuel, somehow still alive. They dug frantically toward the sound, but the tunnel only led them to solid rock. The knocking never stopped. Some claimed they still heard it at night, echoing through the shafts long after the search ended. An old-timer, Jacob Lowe, muttered a phrase the company men didn't like. "It ain't Samuel. It's the mountain. It keeps what it wants." By the early 1920s, the workforce was a mix of immigrants, Finns, Italians, Irishmen, all lured by steady pay. Superstition followed them into the mines. One Italian crew refused to enter a drift after claiming they saw a man standing there, motionless. The figure had worn no helmet, no lamp. His face was gray with dust, eyes black as coal. They shouted at him, but he gave no reply. Then he simply stepped backward into the dark and was gone. When the foreman sent others to check, the drift was empty. The floor bore no tracks. That crew never returned to work. One of the most chilling artifacts came from the foreman of Tunnel 7, a man named Edward Hanley. His journal, discovered years later in the abandoned office, recorded strange entries alongside production numbers. Men report laughter in unoccupied drifts. 2 injured today after running blindly in panic. A miner swore he saw his wife down here, standing in the lamplight. She's in Seattle. He wept when he realized it wasn't her. I myself heard it tonight. A choir, faint but echoing. Sounded like children singing. No children in the mines. The final entry, written in a jagged hand, read, "Whatever dwells in this mountain does not want us here. It feeds on us. I feel it closer each day." Among the miners, a legend began to spread. They called her the Copper Woman. Some swore she was a spirit of the mountain. Others said she was the ghost of a miner's wife who had died waiting for her husband. She was described as tall, draped in a shawl that shimmered like ore. Her skin gleamed faintly red in the lamplight. She would appear at the end of a tunnel, watching. If a man followed her, he was never seen again. In 1924, 2 young miners went missing. Their lamps and tools were found discarded on the floor as if dropped mid-step. Scrawled in dust on the rock wall was a single word: behind. Ore carts rattled through narrow tracks drawn by mules. One night in 1927, a cart returned to the surface half full, though it had left loaded with ore. The mule was missing, harness torn. The driver, a boy no older than 16, was found crouched at the edge of the track, trembling. He wouldn't speak for days. When he finally did, he whispered, "Hands." Hands came out of the walls. They pulled at the cart. They pulled at the mule. I swear it. The company hushed the story, but miners whispered it in bunks for years after. By the late 1930s, the copper veins thinned. Families departed. Machinery was left mid-operation. Even the hospital, with beds still made, was abandoned. But the last crews to leave reported something they never told the company men. On their final night underground, they heard a chorus of voices rising from the tunnels. It wasn't speech. It was chanting, a low, rhythmic drone that built until the walls vibrated. Lanterns flickered. The air turned icy. They fled before dawn. One man swore he felt something brush his back as he climbed the ladder out, a cold hand pressing, as if to drag him back down. Today, Kennecott is preserved as a historic landmark. Tourists walk its boardwalks, marveling at the massive wooden mill. Guides speak of engineering marvels, not ghosts. Yet hikers who wander near the mines often report strange experiences. The tunnels exhale cold air, even in summer. Shadows move in torchlight. Some claim to hear singing from within the sealed drifts. Others speak of a woman's silhouette waiting just beyond the light. In 2011, 2 hikers who camped near the site fled at midnight, leaving their gear behind. They later said they heard footsteps circling their tent, slow and deliberate. When they shone a flashlight, nothing was there, but the snow bore massive, barefoot tracks leading toward the abandoned mill. The story of Kennecott is one of wealth and abandonment, but beneath it lies something darker, a hunger within the stone itself. Miners spoke of whispers, laughter, apparitions, and disappearances. And though historians dismiss these tales as fatigue and imagination, those who lived there swore otherwise. They said the mountain was alive, that it resented the men who cut into it, that it kept what it wanted. Even now, the tunnels remain closed, their mouths dark against the mountainside. But locals say if you put your ear to the rock, you might still hear the knocking. Some say it is just the mountain settling. Others say it is Samuel Briggs, trapped for eternity, and others still claim it is the Copper Woman, waiting for another voice to answer. If you stand among the ruins at night, the Klondike Gold Rush brought thousands of desperate souls north into Alaska, chasing the promise of fortune. In 1897, Diea was one of the gateways. It sat at the mouth of the Diea River, its muddy streets lined with saloons, boarding houses, supply shops, and tents stretching as far as the eye could see. But Diea's prosperity was short-lived. The White Pass and Yukon Route Railroad bypassed it, favoring nearby Skagway. Within a few short years, Diea was abandoned, left to rot beneath creeping moss and choking fog. Yet the town did not die quietly. Hundreds had perished in avalanches on the Chilkoot Trail, in duels from disease and in drunken violence. Their bodies were never all recovered. Locals whisper that the dead never left. Travelers still claim to see ghostly prospectors trudging the trail, skeletal hands clutching empty pans, eyes filled with endless hunger. This is Diea, the gold rush town that vanished into mist, but whose spirits never let go. The most infamous tragedy of Diea struck in April of 1898. A massive avalanche swept down the Chilkoot Pass, burying over 60 stampeders alive. Men clawed at the snow with bare hands, unearthing twisted bodies frozen mid-scream. Years later, hikers reported strange sights near the avalanche site. One survivor, long after he had returned to Seattle, admitted he'd fled the scene after unearthing a figure that should have been dead, a prospector with glassy eyes who whispered, "Keep climbing." "There's gold at the top!" The man stumbled away in terror. When rescuers dug the same spot hours later, they found no trace of the body he described. Diea's collapse was so sudden that many buildings were simply abandoned. In the 1920s, a trapper named Robert Callahan took shelter in the remains of an inn. He later told his son of a night unlike any other. As snow fell heavy outside, he lit a fire in the old stove and tried to sleep. But around midnight, he awoke to the sound of boots crunching across the floorboards. One by one, shadows filled the room. Men in ragged coats, eyes sunken, carrying picks and pans. They did not speak, but their lips moved in silence, as if muttering prayers. Robert said they surrounded him, staring, their bodies dripping with snow that never melted. When he leapt up to shout, they vanished, but the floor remained soaked, footprints leading toward the door that had never opened. Modern hikers on the Chilkoot Trail often describe the same phenomenon, the sense of being watched. A pair of hikers in 1987, Mary and Alan, described losing their way in a thick fog near Diea's ruins. Alan swore he saw a man standing just beyond the mist. He wore an old fur-lined coat, shoulders stooped, holding a lantern that glowed an unnatural blue. When Alan called out, the figure slowly turned. His face was not a face at all, but a hollowed mask of ice. Mary screamed, and the fog swallowed the figure whole. Disease ran rampant during the gold rush. Smallpox claimed children whose graves still lie hidden in the moss. Some say their laughter still lingers. In 1974, a photographer camping near Diea woke at night to the sound of giggles. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside his tent. What he saw chilled him. 3 small children in ragged 19th century clothes, standing hand in hand at the tree line. Their eyes reflected the beam, not like human eyes, but like an animal's. He shouted. They dissolved into the mist. But when he returned to his tent, tiny handprints covered the canvas, pressed from the outside. One of Diea's most notorious figures was a gambler named Thomas Gray. In 1898, he was shot dead during a card game dispute. His body was dragged into the snow, never buried. For decades afterward, travelers reported hearing the shuffle of cards in Diea's saloon ruins. A park ranger in the 1960s swore he found a deck scattered on a broken table. Though no one had been there in months, when he bent to pick up the cards, he realized they were marked, every single one spattered with dried black blood. In 1935, an old prospector named Henry Larson returned to Diea, chasing memories. He claimed he had unfinished business, a load he swore was nearby. Henry was last seen walking into the fog, muttering about the trail. Days later, searchers found his campsite abandoned. His journal lay open, the final entry smeared in mud. They're calling me up the pass. Voices in the snow. I see them, clear as day. They found the mother lode and they want me to join them. Henry was never seen again. On stormy nights, some locals swear you can still hear the beat of a drum echoing across Diea. It is said to be the spirit of Tlingit warriors, whose land was stolen during the gold rush, drumming to call the dead home. One fisherman anchored near the shore in 1991 told of lying awake, listening to the steady rhythm. When he peered through the cabin window, he saw torches flickering along the ruined trail. Dozens of figures marched in silence, their shadows swallowed by the fog. By the 1940s, Diea was swallowed almost entirely by the forest. Yet bush pilots flying overhead sometimes reported seeing lights, as though the town had never died. Lanterns glowing in rows, fires flickering in hearths, smoke rising into the cold night. One pilot swore he saw the streets alive with movement, wagons and figures bustling as if the gold rush still raged. When he circled back, everything was gone. Only the moss-covered ruins remained. Diea's small cemetery holds many of the avalanche dead. Crosses lean and sink into the ground. Visitors often report strange occurrences, sudden drops in temperature, whispers threading through the trees. In 2003, a group of hikers exploring the graveyard claimed to see a woman kneeling at one of the graves. She wept, face hidden in her hands. But when they approached, the woman raised her head, and her eyes were hollow black pits. The group fled, leaving their gear behind. Diea is now part of Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park. Rangers guide tourists through the ruins, but they do not speak of the strange reports. They do not mention the laughter, the lights, or the whispers on the trail. Yet ask the locals, and they'll warn you Diea may be abandoned. But it is not empty. The mist still rolls heavy from the river, carrying voices of the lost. Shadows move along the trail at night, and phantom prospectors march eternally toward riches they will never find. The gold is gone. The town is gone, but the dead still climb. Far out in the Bering Sea, 40 miles from the Alaskan mainland, rises a jagged rock called King Island. For centuries, the Inupiat people lived there in the village of Ukivok, clinging to the cliffs like seabirds. Their homes, built on stilts, seem to defy gravity. Fragile wooden structures perched against sheer stone, lashed by violent winds and blanketed by endless snow. In summer, families hunted walrus and seal, gathered bird eggs, and dried fish along the rocky shores. In winter, they withdrew into their cliffside dwellings, where howling storms rattled the stilts, and snow buried the world outside. Life was harsh, but it endured. Children played along the narrow walkways, elders carved ivory, and hunters braved the ice. By the mid-20th century, government pressures and disease forced the villagers to leave. Schools and hospitals on the mainland lured families away, and in the 1950s, Ukivok was abandoned. Today, the houses still cling to the cliffs, windows gaping, wood blackened by decades of storms. From a distance, the village looks like a skeleton, an empty ribcage clinging to stone. But those who dare sail near King Island say Ukivok is not empty. Shadows move behind shattered windows. Strange chanting echoes across the waves. And sometimes, when the fog rolls low, figures are seen climbing the stilts, returning to homes long forsaken. This is the story of Ukivok, the cliffside ghost town where the ancestors never left. In the summer of 1959, two fishermen from Nome, Peter and Michael, sailed near King Island to check their crab pots. A fog descended quickly, muffling the horizon. As they drifted close to the cliffs, Peter pointed toward the abandoned village. "Lights," he whispered. Through the mist, faint orange flickers glowed in the windows. Not just one, but dozens, as though every house were alive with firelight. Michael squinted, heart pounding. That place is empty. Yet as they watched, shadows moved past the windows, silhouettes of men and women, some stooped with age, others carrying bundles as if still living their daily routines. The fog thickened and the lights vanished. But that night, anchored offshore, the men swore they heard chanting, low, rhythmic, rising and falling like waves. Neither of them slept. When they returned to Nome, Peter refused to sail near King Island again. When the government relocated families to Nome, some elders resisted. They said Ukivok was sacred, that their ancestors' spirits dwelled there. A teacher assigned to the relocation program, Eleanor Hayes, kept a journal. Her entry from October 1953 is chilling. The children refuse to sleep indoors here. They say the ancestors visit them in dreams, asking why they left the cliffs. One boy woke screaming, saying he saw his grandfather standing at the end of his bed, dripping seawater. The elders nod as if this is expected. I am unnerved. Months later, Eleanor resigned and left Alaska altogether. Her journal was found decades later in an archive. In 1972, an adventurer named David Monroe attempted to scale King Island's cliffs. He wanted photographs of the abandoned homes, still clinging to the rock face. He began his climb at dawn. The sea crashed below, gulls shrieked overhead. Halfway up, he heard something, a creak like footsteps on wood. He froze, pressed against stone. Above him, on one of the narrow wooden walkways, a figure appeared. A man in a fur parka, hood drawn low, walking slowly along the stilts. David waved and shouted, assuming perhaps someone had returned. The figure stopped, turned, and looked down. David later told friends that the man's face was wrong, flat, pale, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly white. Terrified, David scrambled back down. He never reached the village. The photographs he took show only blurred planks of wood and endless fog. Local hunters avoid King Island, but in 1984, a small group anchored nearby after pursuing walrus. They camped on the beach overnight. Around midnight, one hunter, Joseph, awoke to the sound of drums. The rhythm was unmistakable, traditional Inupiat drumming, steady and powerful. He sat up listening. Soon, voices joined in song, echoing across the cliffs. The other hunters stirred, whispering in fear. The village above was supposed to be empty. Yet as they watched, torchlight flickered along the walkways, moving from house to house. Joseph swore he saw dancers silhouetted against the cliff, their arms raised in ritual. But the moment he blinked, the lights vanished. The sea fell silent. The hunters left at dawn, abandoning their catch. They told no one until years later, when alcohol loosened their tongues. In 1995, a documentary team visited King Island to film its unique history. One cameraman, Aaron, ventured into one of the houses with his equipment. The interior was coated in dust. Whale bones hung from rafters, carvings lay scattered. As Aaron panned his camera, he heard faint whispers. Thinking it was his crew, he called out, but no one replied. Later, reviewing the footage, Aaron froze. On tape behind him, a figure moved across the room. It was faint, translucent, but clearly human, a woman carrying a basket. She glided past, then dissolved into shadow. Aaron quit the project, shaken, The documentary was never completed. A Nome woman named Clara, whose family once lived on King Island, claimed that her late husband still visited her in dreams. She described waking in her bed to find him standing at the foot, dripping seawater, as though just pulled from the Bering Sea. One night, he spoke, "Clara, come back with me. They're waiting." When she asked who, his mouth opened impossibly wide, and seawater poured onto the floor. She woke screaming. Neighbors reported she refused to sleep indoors after that, choosing instead to doze outside, wrapped in blankets, until her death. In 2002, a sailor drifting near King Island reported seeing a child playing along the stilts. The boy balanced easily, arms outstretched, laughing. Shocked, the sailor raised binoculars. The child's face was gaunt, skin stretched tight. His laughter carried across the waves, but his mouth never moved. As the sailor watched, the boy climbed into a house and vanished. Later, when he described the sighting to locals, they told him the boy matched descriptions of a child who had died of pneumonia in the 1940s. King Island is almost always wrapped in fog. Pilots flying overhead sometimes report hearing static on their radios as they pass, but some swear it is not static at all. One bush pilot passing in 2010 recorded the sound. When played back, it was faint but distinct, voices chanting in a language he did not know. Linguists later identified the words as fragments of old Inupiat songs. The Alaskan gold rush brought thousands of dreamers north. In the late 1800s, the beaches near Nome glittered with gold dust and towns sprang up overnight. One of them was Solomon, a booming camp that rose at the mouth of the Solomon River, 40 miles east of Nome. For a few short years, Solomon thrived. Prospectors flooded in. Saloons, hotels, and stores lined the muddy streets. Barges unloaded supplies and horses dragged equipment into the hills. By 1900, Solomon was alive with shouting miners, clinking glasses, and the constant rattle of sluice boxes. But prosperity never lasts long on the Alaskan coast. Storms battered the town relentlessly. Ice choked the harbor in winter, and summer floods washed away cabins. By 1910, Solomon was half abandoned. By 1913, it was nearly gone. Some said the sea swallowed it. Others whispered the land itself rejected it. Today, little remains but rotting pilings, half-buried timbers, and the graveyard, a scattering of wooden crosses sinking into tundra. Locals avoid the area. They say Solomon never died. They say it drowned, and something still stirs beneath the tides. This is the story of Solomon, the drowned mining camp. At its height, Solomon had more than 1,000 people. The Solomon Roadhouse, built in 1904, became a hub for travelers. Saloons ran non-stop, spilling music and gunfire into the night. But the town's foundation was fragile. Cabins stood on shifting sandbars, only feet above high tide. The river flooded often, sweeping away entire blocks. Miners rebuilt, but each year the ocean ate more of the shore. In the winter of 1913, disaster struck. A powerful storm surged inland, smashing cabins and drowning horses in icy water. Survivors staggered into the hills, watching helplessly as waves devoured the town. When the storm passed, Solomon was gone. The ocean had swallowed most of it. Only the roadhouse and a scattering of cabins remained, battered and broken. Many miners left and never returned, but some did not leave. Their bodies were never found. And according to legend, they never left Solomon at all. The Solomon Roadhouse still stands, rebuilt several times, but the stories surrounding it have never faded. Travelers who stayed there in the mid-20th century reported strange occurrences. One winter night in 1957, a couple traveling by dog sled took shelter in the roadhouse. They lit a fire, unpacked their gear, and settled in. As the wind howled outside, they heard footsteps above them, slow, heavy, pacing the second floor. Assuming another traveler had arrived, the husband went upstairs. But the rooms were empty, the doors still barred with snowdrifts. When he returned, his wife sat frozen in terror. "Someone was standing in the doorway," she whispered. A man, dripping wet, his skin blue. The couple fled into the storm, preferring the deadly cold to the roadhouse's shadow. In 1971, a prospector named Harold camped near the ruins of Solomon. He was searching for old tailings, hoping to pan forgotten gold from the river. That night, as he cooked over his fire, he heard coughing, deep, wet gurgling. He grabbed his lantern and searched the beach. There, half buried in sand, was a man. His clothes were old, ragged, his boots split. His skin was pale, lips purple. Seawater dribbled from his mouth as he tried to speak. Harold lunged forward, but the man dissolved into foam, washing back into the tide. The next morning, Harold packed his gear and left. He never mined Solomon again. The graveyard at Solomon is one of the eeriest in Alaska. Wooden crosses lean in all directions, many nearly swallowed by grass. Few names remain legible. In 1986, a group of travelers camped nearby. They claimed to hear voices around the graves at night, men arguing, women crying, horses screaming as though drowning. One man swore he saw lanterns moving among the graves, bobbing as though miners searched for something. Yet when he approached, there was nothing but wind and snow. By dawn, their tents were coated in frost from inside, as if the cold had seeped through their bodies. They fled without finishing breakfast. Locals whisper about the woman in the waves. She is said to appear just offshore at twilight, rising from the surf with long black hair streaming. In 1993, a fisherman named Bill reported seeing her. He was hauling nets when he noticed a figure in the shallows, waist deep in freezing water. Thinking she was stranded, he called out. The woman turned. Her face was bloated, skin mottled with blue veins. Her eyes were milky white. Bill dropped his net and stumbled back. The woman raised one hand as though beckoning him into the water. Then a wave crashed over her and she was gone. Bill never fished near Solomon again. Perhaps the strangest stories come during storms. Residents of Nome claim that when the wind howls from the east, you can hear Solomon, not the ocean, not the wind, but Solomon itself. They describe voices, hundreds of them, carried on the gale. Shouts of miners, clatter of bottles, the distant shriek of a fiddle, and beneath it all, screams. One elder swore that on the anniversary of the 1913 storm, the town returns for a single night. Lanterns blaze, music plays, and drowned miners walk the sand once more. But no one dares go and see for themselves. In 2007, an amateur photographer named Karen visited Solomon to capture the ruins. She spent hours shooting decayed pilings and rusted machinery. When she developed her film, one image stood out. It showed the beach at dusk, the tide creeping in. But in the frame's corner stood a man in a bowler hat, holding a gold pan. Karen was certain no one else had been there. His reflection appeared faintly in the water, but not in the sand. She never returned to Solomon, and the photograph vanished from her collection. Friends say she burned it. Travelers along the Nome Council Road sometimes camp near Solomon, unaware of its history. Many wake to strange sounds, laughter, clinking glasses, piano music carried faintly on the wind. One camper in 2015 recorded the noise on his phone. The audio captured faint voices singing an old tune, followed by a loud crash and screaming. The recording cuts off abruptly, replaced by static. He uploaded it online, but skeptics called it fake. Yet those who have camped there nod grimly. They've heard it too. At low tide, bits of Solomon's past still surface: iron stoves, rusted tools, fragments of timber. But some say these relics carry more than history. In 2018, a tourist pocketed an old horseshoe from the beach. That night she dreamed she was drowning. Men in soaked coats pulled her into the surf, laughing as she struggled. She woke gasping, her bed soaked with seawater. The horseshoe was gone, she told locals who shook their heads. You don't take from Solomon, they warned. It takes back. Legends claim that deep in the ruins, one building still stands in another world, the tavern. Miners who died in the 1913 storm are said to drink there still. Glasses never empty, cards always in play. But the price of admission is steep. If you hear laughter on the wind near Solomon, never follow it. Because those who enter the tavern never return. Some say their faces can be seen in the surf. Eyes wide, mouths open, forever calling for one more drink. Today, Solomon is marked on maps as little more than a ghost site. A handful of cabins remain inland, used seasonally by locals. The old roadhouse is still visited by travelers, though many refuse to sleep inside. The beach itself lies silent, swallowed by tides and storms. Yet those who walk it say the sand feels uneasy, shifting underfoot, as though something stirs below. They warn never to linger after dark. Because when the tide rises, the past rises too, And Solomon, the drowned mining camp, remembers everyone who dared to call it home. Nome, Alaska, is a place born of desperation. It began not as a planned settlement, but as a fever dream. In 1898, 3 prospectors found gold on Anvil Creek, and the rumor spread like wildfire. Within months, 20,000 men and women flooded into the barren tundra, erecting tents, shacks, and saloons along the shore of the Bering Sea. At its peak, Nome was the largest city in Alaska, a wild sprawl of gambling halls, brothels, and ramshackle cabins. The beach itself glittered with gold dust, so rich that some claimed you could scoop it up with a frying pan. Men dug with bare hands, scraping sand into buckets, while ships lined the shore unloading whiskey, dynamite, and guns. But Nome was as deadly as it was rich. Winters came hard and sudden, with storms that blotted out the horizon in a matter of minutes. Frostbite, starvation, and disease claimed thousands. Brawls ended in shootings, bodies dumped into the permafrost. Epidemics of smallpox and influenza swept through camps, filling the graveyard with nameless crosses. Some were buried. Many more were simply swallowed by the tundra, lost beneath drifts of snow. It was said that Nome's gold came with a curse. The earth itself rejected the frenzy. Every storm, every wave that crashed against the shore carried the voices of the dead. And there, in that endless white void, began the oldest stories of figures who appeared when the world vanished in snow. Shadowy silhouettes trudging through storms, their eyes hollow, their mouths frozen mid-scream. To this day, they are called the dead who walk in whiteout. The mail carrier's last ride. The first recorded account comes from 1911, when a mail carrier named Elias drove his dog sled from Council to Nome. Elias was a strong man, broad-shouldered and trusted with the dangerous winter runs. That January, a storm rolled in without warning. The wind screamed across the tundra, erasing all sense of direction. For hours, Elias leaned into the gale, urging his dogs forward. His lantern flickered uselessly in the white void. Then he saw them. Figures in the storm, trudging single file. Relief surged through him. Other travelers, maybe miners caught in the same blizzard. He shouted, raising his whip, but they did not turn. The line of figures marched steadily forward, their shoulders hunched, heads bowed. Their coats looked strange, ragged and patched, scarves frozen stiff. Elias cracked his whip again, closing the distance. That was when one turned its head. Its face was pale as death, skin tight over bone. The eyes were hollow black pits rimmed with frost. Its lips parted, moving soundlessly, as if trying to speak. The dogs screamed. They lunged sideways, their harnesses tangling, dragging the sled into a snowbank. Elias fought to control them, heart hammering in his chest. When he looked back, the figures were gone. Only the endless white remained. Hours later, half frozen, Elias stumbled into an abandoned trapper's cabin. He survived the night, but when he reached Nome and told his story, the elders only nodded grimly. "You saw them," one said. "The ones who never made it out of the storms." The prospectors circled 2 decades later. In 1934, a pair of prospectors vanished east of Nome. Their names were Jacob and Morgan, veterans of the goldfields who refused to give up the dream. When a sudden storm hit, they failed to return. Search parties combed the tundra for days. At last, they found the men's sled overturned, gear scattered across the snow. Their bodies were gone. What chilled the searchers most were the footprints, dozens of them circling the sled. Not 2 men, not 3, but many. The prints were barefoot, naked soles pressed into snow. The rescuers whispered prayers and fled the site, refusing to search further. Jacob and Morgan were never found. The nurse's window, Nome, is remembered for the 1925 diphtheria outbreak, the crisis that brought the serum run, the desperate relay of dog teams racing life-saving medicine through storms. But few recall the nurse who claimed to see something else during that terrible winter. Her name was Anna. She worked tirelessly, tending to fevered children in a drafty shack that served as an infirmary. One night, as a blizzard howled through town, Anna peered through a frost-caked window. The street outside should have been empty. Yet she saw people standing there, dozens of them motionless in the storm. Their clothes were ragged, their skin white as snow. One raised a hand and pointed at her. Anna gasped and stumbled back. When she looked again, the figures were gone. That night, every child in her care died. For the rest of her life, Anna swore she had seen the dead come to claim them. The bush pilot's lights. In 1952, a bush pilot named Robert was flying into Nome when a storm swallowed his plane. Wind buffeted the craft, ice creeping over the wings. His fuel was nearly gone when he spotted lights below, lanterns moving steadily through the storm. Believing they were searchers guiding him, Robert landed on the beach. But when he stepped into the snow, the lights vanished. No footprints, no sled tracks, only untouched snow. Robert staggered into Nome half frozen, warning the other pilots. Don't follow lights in a whiteout. They're not from the living. The Phantom Sled. The 1970s brought the Iditarod, the legendary sled dog race from Anchorage to Nome. Mushers training in the brutal weather began whispering of strange encounters. One, a veteran named Carl, swore he was passed by another team during a blizzard near Nome. The dogs were ghostly pale, their paws leaving no marks. The driver's face was hidden behind a crust of ice. The sled glided silently past, yet Carl felt the icy wind of its passage brushing his cheek. When he told the tale in Nome, the old miners only shook their heads. The race isn't just for the living, they said. The Soldiers Patrol. In 1982, an Army communications unit stationed near Nome reported losing a soldier during a whiteout. His name was Private Daniels. His squad claimed they saw him walking just ahead, following another figure through the storm, a tall man in a long coat. They shouted, but the wind swallowed their voices. When they reached the end of their rope line, Daniels was gone. The other figure vanished with him. His body was never recovered. The Army declared him missing. Locals whispered the dead had claimed another, the tourists' whisper. In 2013, a tourist named Michael from Seattle visited Nome to photograph the aurora. A storm rolled in suddenly, and he became lost on the outskirts of town. Through the white curtain, a man appeared. His beard was frozen solid, his eyes sunken. He walked beside Michael, leaning close to whisper, "This way." Michael followed for several minutes before realizing the man left no tracks. Panicked, he turned and stumbled blindly. By luck, he found a fence and followed it to safety. Later, he told locals. One old woman shook her head. "If you'd kept following, you wouldn't be here." The drifting voices Nome residents still speak of voices carried on the wind. Some sound like laughter, others like screaming. In 2020, students from Anchorage recorded audio during a blizzard. Beneath the roar of wind faintly came a song, an old miner's tune, words slurred as though sung by drunken men. Skeptics dismissed it as interference. But the locals knew better. The Endless March. The most terrifying legend is the Endless March. Witnesses describe entire processions appearing in storms, miners, women in ragged shawls, even children clutching toys of ice. They trudge endlessly through snow, faces hidden, mouths open in soundless cries. Some say they are the souls of those who died searching for gold, cursed to wander forever. Others believe they are omens appearing before disaster. One elder warned, "When you see them, never look too long. If you do, you'll join their line. Nome today, Nome survives." A modern city clings to the edge of the Bering Sea, its people hardened by a century of storms. But the dead still walk when the whiteouts come. Doors are locked early, curtains drawn, and no one peers too long into the snow. Because in Nome, when the horizon vanishes and the world is nothing but white, the dead return. And if you ever... At the very tip of Alaska's northwestern coast lies a land few outsiders have ever seen, Point Hope. It is a narrow spit of frozen tundra, jutting like a finger into the gray waters of the Chukchi Sea. To the untrained eye, it is bleak, a desolate place where wind carves the ground into ridges and the sea ice presses against the shore with a low, grinding groan. But to the Inupiat, Point Hope has always been sacred. For centuries, it was the largest whaling community in the Arctic, a place where hunters launched skin boats into icy waters to bring down bowhead whales, animals that could feed a village for an entire season. Yet for all its life-giving bounty, Point Hope holds a darker name in whispered legend. Elders speak of it not just as a place of survival, but as a graveyard that breathes. They call it Tikaraluk, the place where the earth eats the living. Long before missionaries came, Point Hope was already layered with the dead. Archaeologists later discovered hundreds of skeletons buried in mass graves, some stacked upon each other, skulls split open. Ribs shattered. The explanation offered was famine, epidemics, and warfare between whaling clans. But the Inupiat told a different story. They said the earth itself had grown hungry. During storms, holes opened in the tundra, sinkholes that swallowed whole camps, sleds, and people. When the wind carried voices, they said, it wasn't just memory. It was the dead calling for more. In 1826, British explorer Captain Frederick Beechey anchored off the coast near Point Hope. His men went ashore to trade for meat. What they found chilled them. The village lay half buried in snow. From a distance, it seemed abandoned. But as they drew closer, they saw figures standing between the huts. Thin, motionless. When the sailors approached, the figures toppled forward. They were corpses, dried by wind, faces blackened by frost. Beechey wrote in his journal, "Never have I seen a place so haunted by death." The very earth seemed unwilling to let them rest. Bones jutted from the ground, as though the soil rejected them. The sailors fled back to their ship, refusing to camp on land. By the late 19th century, American missionaries tried to civilize Point Hope. They built schools, churches, and houses. One missionary, Reverend Samuel Carter, kept a diary that would never be published. In November 1893, he wrote of strange holes opening in the village paths, perfectly round, rimmed with black ice. At night, he heard cries echoing from their depths, not the whistling of wind, but human voices, sobbing, pleading. One evening, a young girl vanished. She had been playing near the edge of a hole. The next morning, her sled was found overturned, her mitten lying in the snow. But the hole was gone, frozen solid, as if it had never been there. Reverend Carter left Point Hope the following spring. His last entry read, "The earth devours the children here. This place is cursed. God forgive me for leaving them." Old Inupiat hunters still tell of Kigliak, a man who vanished in 1931. He had gone onto the tundra to check his traps during a storm. His dogs returned hours later, their harnesses dragging empty. When the storm cleared, the villagers searched. They found Kigliak's trail in the snow, boot prints steady and unbroken. Then, without warning, the tracks ended. No stumble, no struggle. Just an empty patch of tundra. Beneath the snow lay a wide depression, frozen smooth. Elders said the ground had opened and taken him. To this day, hunters warn their children, never walk alone when the snow swirls. The ground remembers hunger. In 1958, geologists came to Point Hope searching for oil. They drilled test holes in the permafrost. One night, a drilling team reported hearing moans rising from the shaft. At first, they thought it was the wind trapped in the pipe, but when they lowered microphones, the sounds grew louder. Cries, whispers, and what one man swore was the chanting of voices in a language he did not understand. 2 workers quit the very next day. The others filled the holes and left without explanation. Their notes were sealed in company archives, but locals still whisper of the hole that cried like a man. In 1974, a bush pilot named Henry tried to land near Point Hope during a blizzard. His plane vanished from radar. Search parties later found the wreckage on the tundra. The wings sheared, the fuselage split open, but Henry's body was never found. The snow around the wreck was undisturbed, as if he had simply stepped out and vanished. When villagers approached, they felt a hollow beneath their feet. The ground gave slightly, like a drum stretched thin. They retreated, terrified that the tundra might open beneath them. To this day, the wreckage remains half buried, untouched. In the 1980s, a schoolteacher named Linda moved to Point Hope from Anchorage. At first, she dismissed the stories as folklore. But one winter night, walking home after class, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. No one. Then the snow beneath her shifted. She froze, heart pounding. The path ahead rippled as if something massive crawled beneath the ice. A crack split open. From the darkness, a pale hand reached upward, fingers clawing at the air. Linda screamed and ran. When she returned with others, the crack was gone. Only smooth ice remained. She left Point Hope the next year. In Anchorage, when asked why, she would only say, "The ground moves there. It's alive, and it wants us." In recent decades, Point Hope has been plagued by sinkholes. Some swallow snowmobiles. Others devour storage sheds overnight. In 2007, a hunter's body was found half buried, twisted in frozen earth. His torso protruded from the ground, but his legs were gone, as though the tundra had swallowed him whole. Locals refused to touch the body. They burned the area instead, believing it cursed. Scientists blame thawing permafrost, but villagers know better. They whisper that the ancient hunger is waking again. In 2016, a tourist from Germany visited Point Hope to photograph whaling boats. He vanished one night during a storm. Days later, searchers found his camera half buried in snow. The last photo was blurred but clear enough to see. A line of figures stood on the tundra. Some half submerged, their torsos rising from the ground. Their mouths were open, screaming. One hand, pale, skeletal, reached directly toward the lens. The man was never found. Today, Point Hope is still inhabited. Children play in the snow. Hunters launch boats for whales each spring. But the old warnings remain. When the wind rises, doors are barred. When the snow swirls, no one walks alone. And when holes open in the ground, no one dares to look too closely. Because Point Hope is not just a village. It is a wound in the earth. A place where the past refuses burial. And the dead, hungry for company, are always waiting. The tunnel feels alive, not in the way of machinery or traffic, but alive like something breathing just beneath your feet. You can hear it when the wind dies down, a hollow thrum like the ribs of a sleeping beast. This is Whittier, Alaska, a place unlike any other in the world. A city crammed beneath a mountain, where almost every resident lives inside a single building. And the only way in or out is through a tunnel that swallows cars and spits them out into silence. It is beautiful. Hemmed in by glaciers, waterfalls and peaks that catch the sun like broken glass. But beauty in Alaska is often deceptive. Whittier wears its strangeness proudly. The locals know it, the visitors feel it, and those who stay long enough begin to whisper of shadows that never leave the tunnels, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, and a presence that presses down heavier than the mountain itself. For Whittier is more than just an oddity. It is a place where the living and the dead have been forced to share walls. During World War II, the U.S. military sought remote strongholds, hidden from enemy eyes yet close enough to the Pacific to act as staging grounds. Whittier was chosen, a natural harbor shielded by mountains, accessible only through tunnels carved into stone. In 1943, thousands of soldiers and engineers poured into the region, blasting through rock, erecting warehouses, and building what would become the Buckner Building, at the time, the largest building in Alaska. Concrete, windowless, sprawling, it was meant to be a fortress against both enemy attack and the unforgiving Arctic. But soldiers wrote letters home describing the unease. The tunnels sweated water constantly, dripping like 1,000 hidden leaks. The air smelled of rust and mildew. Lights flickered, and when generators failed, the blackness was total. So heavy it pressed against their eyelids even when they forced them wide. A few men deserted. Others claimed to hear voices in the ventilation shafts, whispers that weren't English and sometimes weren't human at all. The military called it stress. The soldiers called it haunted. The Buckner Building still stands today, though abandoned since the 1964 earthquake cracked its bones and flooded its innards. Locals call it the city under one roof. Step inside and you'll understand why few dare linger. The hallways stretch on, swallowing flashlight beams. Ceiling tiles hang loose like pale tongues. In some rooms, the floors are slick with algae, puddles of brackish water reflecting the beams back at you like eyes. And then there are the sounds. Explorers who enter report footsteps pacing a floor above, when the floor above has collapsed years ago. Doors slam though no wind cuts through. More than one person has fled after hearing their own name whispered from behind a rusting door. In 1992, a pair of teenagers broke into Buckner on a dare. They told their friends they'd explore the old mess hall. Hours passed. When their friends went to retrieve them, they found the teens huddled in a corner. Pale and shaking, one of them, a boy named Alex, later confessed that he'd seen a man in uniform watching them from the far end of the hall. At first he thought it was just another explorer, but the man's face was wrong, too pale, his eyes completely black. And when the teens shined their flashlight on him, the figure dissolved into water that splashed onto the floor and spread toward them. Alex never went back. Neither did his friend. On March 27, 1964, a magnitude 9.2 earthquake struck Alaska, the most powerful ever recorded in North America. Whittier was hit hard. Tsunamis ripped through the harbor, collapsing docks and swallowing warehouses. Landslides roared down the mountainsides. Inside Buckner, ceilings cracked. Walls split, entire sections filled with seawater. Dozens were killed, their bodies never recovered, swept into the concrete hollows that remain sealed to this day. Survivors spoke of screams echoing long after the water had receded, screams muffled, distorted, coming from within walls that should have been solid. Even now, residents swear they hear cries rising from Buckner's lowest levels when storms roll in off the sound. They say the building is a tomb, still housing those who drowned inside, their souls forever pacing its dripping corridors. The only way to reach Whittier is through the Anton Anderson Memorial Tunnel, a 2.5-mile stretch bored straight through solid mountain. Originally a rail tunnel, it was later converted for vehicles, but still only allows one-way traffic at a time. When you drive it, your headlights illuminate nothing but wet rock, walls that seem too close, and fans that drone like distant engines. The air is stale, heavy with stone dust and fuel, and then there are the stories. Truckers say they've seen shadows pacing along the walls, keeping speed with their vehicles. Tourists have reported headlights in the rearview mirror, bright, blinding, only for no car to emerge when they exit the tunnel. In 2003, a couple from Anchorage broke down inside. The engine died, their phones had no signal, and the tunnel went eerily silent. Then faintly, they heard it, footsteps approaching from the darkness. Slow, heavy. The man grabbed a flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, but there was no one. Still, the footsteps continued, circling their car, tapping against the metal. When the rescue truck finally arrived, the couple begged the driver not to leave them alone. Their car was towed out, abandoned in a garage for months, because neither of them ever wanted to sit inside it again. Most of Whittier's residents live inside the Begich Towers, a 14-story building originally built for military families. Today it holds apartments, a post office, a grocery, even a church, all under one roof. On paper it sounds convenient. In reality, it is claustrophobic. Long, narrow hallways lined with identical doors. The hum of old pipes. The constant awareness that nearly every aspect of your life is confined within concrete walls. And of course, the noises. Residents whisper of knocking that comes from inside the walls at night. Of elevators that stop on empty floors and refuse to move. Of figures seen reflected in the glass doors of the lobby, though no one stands outside. In 2011, a woman named Carla moved into the tower with her son. The first few nights were quiet. Then her boy began waking up screaming. He said a man in uniform was standing at the end of his bed, dripping water onto the carpet. Carla checked. Nothing. But in the morning, a wet footprint remained, leading from the bed to the hall door. They moved out 3 months later. In 2017, a travel blogger documented her night in Whittier. She explored Buckner during the day, dismissing the graffiti and vandalism as more unsettling than any ghosts. But that night, as she lay in her rented room in the tower, she wrote the following. The sea around Cordova does not forgive. It rises without warning, it swallows whole crews, and it keeps what it takes. Ask any fisherman who has worked these waters long enough, and they will tell you, the sound remembers. Cordova, perched on the eastern edge of Prince William Sound, is a place built on the back of the ocean. Once it was a booming fishing hub, its docks crowded with canneries and its streets filled with men who wagered their lives against the tides. But the ocean has always demanded its due. Ships have gone down in sudden squalls, entire canneries have been washed away, and storms have carried men from the shore as though plucking them one by one. Some towns fight back against tragedy with resilience. Cordova learned to live with it. Yet behind the pride, behind the survival, a darker story lingers. One whispered in bunkhouses, muttered over nets, and avoided when strangers ask too many questions. They say the waters here are haunted, that the drowned never rest, and that in the fog when the world turns gray, Cordova becomes a town watched by eyes that no longer live. The boom came with the Copper River and Northwestern Railway in 1908. A new cannery opened, and Cordova grew overnight. But with the growth came accidents. Men drowned unloading cargo, dragged under by currents that seemed too strong for the shallow bay. In September of that year, the steamship Lane sank after striking a submerged rock near the harbor entrance. Dozens were lost. Survivors swore they heard bells ringing in the fog long after the ship went down, though no bells were aboard. One fisherman, Ola Rasmussen, wrote in his journal, "There are voices out there, not the voices of gulls or seals, but men calling from beneath the water. Last night they called my name." Ole's body washed ashore 3 days later, his eyes wide open, his lungs filled not only with water but with sand, as if he had been dragged along the seabed before being released. Cordova's canneries brought wealth, but they also brought tragedy. Fires broke out often, fanned by oil lamps and fish oil. In 1915, a blaze consumed the Pacific cannery, trapping workers inside. Witnesses claimed they saw men at the windows pounding to escape, only to vanish into the flames. But in the weeks after the fire, dock hands began reporting something stranger. When the fog rolled in thick, they swore they could still see the faces at those burned-out windows, pale and distorted, staring out across the bay. By 1921, the town had rebuilt, but the whispers persisted. The fishermen said the sea had claimed not just lives, but souls. One of the most retold stories in Cordova is that of Patrick O'Malley, an Irish deckhand. In 1927, he had been drinking late into the night, staggering along the wharf as fog poured in heavy from the sound. According to the night watchman, O'Malley suddenly stopped and tilted his head as if listening. Then he began speaking, slurring words into the mist. The watchman, thinking him drunk, ignored it. But then O'Malley climbed down the ladder to the water. The watchman shouted, but O'Malley only waved, smiling, and said, "She's calling me. Don't you hear her? She's been waiting all this time." He stepped into the black water and never surfaced. The next morning they dragged the bay. No body was ever found, but some claim that on foggy nights, a man's laughter echoes faintly across the harbor. During World War II, Cordova supplied fish to troops overseas. Men worked around the clock, often through exhaustion. One summer night in 1943, a fleet of small trawlers headed out into the Sound. What they encountered has remained one of Cordova's most chilling tales. As the fog thickened, the lead boat reported seeing lantern lights ahead, an entire fleet of ships emerging from the mist. The vessels were old, their sails ragged, their hulls scarred. Yet they glided silently, no sound of engines or oars. The trawlers cut their lights, terrified of collision. But as the phantom fleet passed, the fishermen realized the figures aboard were not alive. Their faces were bloated, their eyes hollow, water spilling continuously from their mouths. The ghostly ships drifted silently through and vanished into the fog. When the trawlers returned, the men swore never to fish at night again. The Good Friday earthquake of 1964 devastated Cordova's harbor. Docks splintered, warehouses collapsed, and sections of the waterfront sank beneath the sea. Entire families were displaced, their homes erased overnight. In the days after, survivors searching the wreckage began reporting sightings. Children swore they saw figures walking across the surface of the bay at dusk. One man, sifting through debris, claimed his wife's drowned sister called his name from beneath the water, her hand reaching up, before vanishing when he tried to grasp it. Divers sent into the harbor later described hearing voices in their radios that weren't from their teams. One diver surfaced gasping, refusing to return, saying he had seen hundreds of faces beneath the collapsed pilings, staring, waiting. Some still believe the earthquake didn't just take lives. It stirred something that had been sleeping. In the summer of 1998, two kayakers visiting from Oregon set out on the bay at dawn. The fog rolled in quickly, cutting visibility to almost nothing. They heard the low thrum of an engine and turned, expecting a fishing boat. Instead, a massive trawler loomed from the mist, black, hulking, silent. Its deck was lined with figures unmoving, staring down at them. The kayakers screamed, paddling frantically. But when they turned again, the trawler was gone. No sound, no wake, just empty fog. They made it back to shore, shaking, their faces white. Both swore the ship had been dripping water as if the entire vessel had risen straight from the depths. In 2007, a diver named Travis was hired to clear debris from an old... There is a silence in McCarthy that no wind disturbs. A silence thick enough to press on the chest, heavy enough to smother words before they leave the tongue. Visitors who pass through the crumbling streets of this near-forgotten town describe it the same way, as though the place is holding its breath. McCarthy sits tucked deep within the Wrangell Mountains, a place once alive with miners, saloons, and the constant churn of copper wealth from the Kennecott mine. In the early 1900s, it was a town of light, laughter, and noise. But when the mine shut down in 1938, the people fled, leaving McCarthy hollowed out, its wooden buildings left to rot. Yet the town did not die completely. A few stubborn souls remained, and what they began to experience would turn McCarthy from a footnote in Alaskan history into one of its darkest ghost towns. The Kennecott mine was Alaska's pride, a river of copper carved straight from the bones of the Wrangell Mountains. It drew men from across the country, lured by wages that seemed too good to be true. But the mine was cruel. Men lost fingers, hands, entire limbs to machinery. Avalanches buried crews alive. And in the claustrophobic shafts, collapses came without. Warning sealing men in blackness that no lamp could pierce. Miners whispered that the mountain itself resented being hollowed out, that every ton of ore was paid for in blood. By the time the mine closed in 1938, more than 200 lives had been claimed. And yet, locals insisted the dead did not leave. They stayed in McCarthy, restless, bound to the place where the mountain had swallowed them. When Kennecott folded, McCarthy emptied almost overnight. Houses stood abandoned, dishes left on tables, curtains rotting in windows. A few wanderers, trappers, and hermits lived among the ruins. They told unsettling stories, doors slamming. In windless nights, footsteps pacing above them in rooms they knew were empty. Lantern lights bobbing on trails that led nowhere. In 1953, a hunter passing through wrote in his journal that he had seen a figure standing at the mine entrance. A man in a torn work shirt, his face gray and smeared with dirt, his eyes like pits. The figure raised one arm as if to wave, and then dissolved into dust. McCarthy's darkest night came in March of 1983. By then, fewer than 30 people lived in the old town, eking out lives in cabins and crumbling houses. That night, a man named Louis Hastings snapped. Armed with rifles and explosives, he slaughtered 6 of his neighbors in cold blood. The massacre stunned Alaska. McCarthy, already a ghost of itself, seemed cursed beyond repair. But what came after is what residents still whisper about. Survivors claimed they began hearing voices at night, not just of the murdered, but of others, older voices, echoing in languages long dead. Doors opened without sound. Cold drafts swept through rooms as though the victims were walking past. To this day, locals say the 1983 massacre awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the soil of McCarthy for decades. One of the most enduring legends of McCarthy involves the long dirt road that winds 60 miles through wilderness to reach the town. In 1996, a trucker making a rare delivery swore he saw a young girl standing barefoot on the roadside in the snow. He stopped, terrified she might be lost. But when he stepped from his cab, she was gone. That same night, a local trapper reported hearing a child's laughter in the trees, echoing across the valley, though there were no children living in McCarthy at the time. The girl has been seen many times since, pale, silent, always vanishing when approached. The old Golden Saloon still stands, its wood weathered but its shape intact. In 2004, a group of hikers camped nearby swore that while passing the saloon, after midnight they saw figures inside, a dozen or more, their silhouettes moving, drinking, laughing. The building, however, was locked tight, abandoned for decades. One hiker took a photo. The developed image showed not silhouettes but blurred gray faces, each one turned toward the camera, each one open-mouthed as though screaming. The hikers left before dawn. None ever returned. A more recent account comes from 2012, when two documentary filmmakers visited McCarthy to capture footage of the decaying mine structures. While filming near the old bunkhouses, they heard rhythmic stomping, like dozens of boots striking wooden planks. Thinking it might be tourists, they investigated. What they saw made them flee without packing their gear. A procession of miners in torn uniforms marching in single file, heads down, eyes empty. The men passed silently, their bodies dripping mud and water before dissolving into the earth itself. The filmmakers abandoned their equipment and never finished the project. McCarthy has no cell service. Radios are the only lifeline to the outside world. In 2017, a local pilot reported picking up strange transmissions while flying supplies into the town. Instead of chatter or static, he heard miners' voices calling shift schedules, reciting ore weights, reporting injuries. The voices used slang and terminology not spoken in decades. When he landed, his radio went dead. The recordings he made during the flight captured only silence. A handful of people still live in McCarthy. Tourists visit in the summer to see the Kennecott ruins. But at night, when the sun dips behind the mountains and shadows spill down the empty streets, even the bravest admit unease. They say McCarthy is a place where the dead outnumber the living, where the echoes of a massacre, a mine's hunger, and a town abandoned all blur together until it is impossible to know what is memory, what is legend, and what is haunting. And if you stand in the town square long enough, the silence will break. You will hear footsteps. A door will creak open. A window will slam shut. And you will remember that McCarthy is not empty. Not truly. Some ghost towns fade gently, their stories dissolving with the years. McCarthy did not. It was born of violence, men crushed by rock, lives consumed by greed. And it ended in violence, with neighbors slaughtered in their own cabins. The town is a scar carved deep into Alaska's wilderness, and like all scars,